The horse was the color of dust, and so was the man who rode him. Caleb Thorne rode into Blackridge with the setting sun at his back, a long shadow stretching out before him as if to announce his arrival. He moved with the slow, deliberate ease of a man who had spent more time in the saddle than on his own 2 feet. His eyes, the color of a washed-out winter sky, missed nothing. They swept over the sun-bleached clapboard buildings, the deep ruts in the main street, and the weary faces of the people who hurried along the boardwalks, their heads bent against the wind and something more. Blackridge was a town dying of thirst, perched on the edge of a desert that promised nothing but heat and stone. Yet men had gouged a mine into the nearby hills, chasing a rumor of silver, and the town had sprouted like a bitter weed from the barren ground. It smelled of sulfur, stale whiskey, and quiet desperation. This was the place. The last letter from his brother. Ethan had been postmarked from a town just like this one, full of hard men and easy lies. The lie that had put a rope around Ethan's neck had started here, whispered by a man named Silas Croft, and Caleb had come to hear that whisper turn into a scream. He swung down from his horse in front of the livery, the leather of his saddle groaning a tired complaint. The stable hand, a boy no older than 16 with eyes that had already seen too much, took the reins without a word. "Any place a man can get a decent meal that ain't boiled in grease?" Caleb asked, his voice a low rumble, rough like scraped rock. The boy just shrugged and pointed a thumb toward a building across the street with a faded sign that read, "Eat." Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old coffee and onions. A few miners sat hunched over plates of beans, their faces grimed with rock dust. Caleb took a seat at a small table in the corner, a spot that kept his back to the wall and the whole room in his sight. It was a habit he could not break. As he ate the tough steak and watery coffee, he listened. A town's secrets were always carried on the currents of its idle talk. The name he heard most was not Silas Croft, but Reverend Josiah Marsh. "The Reverend says the drought is a test of our faith," one man grumbled to another. "Easy for him to say. His well ain't never run dry." "He says the land belongs to the righteous," the other replied, his voice low and bitter. "And it seems the righteous are the ones with enough money to buy his approval." Caleb finished his meal, the food tasteless in his mouth. He learned that Reverend Marsh was more than a preacher. He was the law, the bank, and the final word in Blackridge. His church was the biggest building in town, a stark white monument to his power, and his word was twisted scripture used to bleed the poor and justify the greed of the mining company that was his true congregation. Silas Croft, Caleb soon discovered, was the Reverend's right hand, the man who did the dirty work. The preacher was too pious to touch himself. Justice here, Caleb realized, would be a complicated thing. The next day was Sunday. The church bell tolled, a hollow, insistent sound that pulled the townspeople from their homes. Curiosity, and the need to see his enemies in one place, drew Caleb toward the gathering. He did not go inside, but stood near the back of the crowd that spilled out from the open doors, leaning against the rough bark of a cottonwood tree. Reverend Josiah Marsh stood at the pulpit, a tall, severe man with a hawk's nose and eyes that burned with a cold fire. His voice boomed across the dusty plaza, a hammer striking an anvil. He spoke of sin and damnation, of the weakness of the flesh and the holy virtue of obedience. He was a master of his craft, weaving fear and faith into a single, suffocating blanket. The people listened, their faces a mixture of reverence and dread. They were thirsty for hope, and he gave them poison disguised as holy water. Caleb's gaze drifted from the preacher to the faces in the crowd, and then he saw her. She stood near the back, almost hidden in the shadows of the church doorway, as if she were trying to be a part of the congregation and escape it at the same time. She was pale, a stark contrast to the sun-beaten faces around her. A simple gray dress hung on her slender frame, and her hair, the color of dark honey, was pulled back so tightly it seemed to hurt. But it was her eyes that held him, They were large and gray, like a morning mist, and they held a sadness so deep it looked like a permanent part of her. She was not listening to the sermon. She was enduring it. Her hands were clasped so tightly at her waist that her knuckles were white. She looked like a ghost at her own father's sermon. He learned her name soon enough. As the crowd dispersed, a woman next to him sighed. "Poor Evelyn," she whispered to her husband. "To be the daughter of a saint must be a heavy cross to bear." Evelyn Marsh, the preacher's daughter, a bird in a gilded cage, and from the look of her, the cage was beginning to rust. That night, the devil came to Blackridge, or at least the version of him that lived in cheap whiskey and bad intentions. Caleb was in the saloon, not for a drink, but for information, nursing a glass of warm beer and listening to the low murmur of conversation. The place was crowded, the air blue with smoke. A small family had come in for supplies. A man whose dark skin and straight black hair spoke of his Mexican heritage. His wife, a pale woman with tired eyes, and their young son, who clung to his mother's skirts. They had kept to themselves, waiting for the bartender to fill their order. But their quiet presence was an offense to a handful of rough miners, drunk and emboldened by their numbers. "Look what we got here," one of them sneered, blocking the family's path to the door. "Some folks don't know their place." The husband, a proud, quiet man, simply tried to step around him. "Excuse us, senor." Another miner shoved him back. "We don't speak that dog language here. You best learn some respect." The child began to cry. The woman pulled him closer, her face a mask of fear. Caleb had seen it 1,000 times before, the ugliness of men who needed to feel big by making others feel small. He had promised himself he would not get involved in this town's troubles, not until he settled his own score. But watching the boy's terrified face, seeing the father's jaw clench as he fought to hold back his anger and protect his family, Caleb felt the old, familiar fire stir in his gut. It was the same fire that had been lit the day he found out about Ethan. Some things a man just could not walk away from. He rose from his chair. The movement was slow, unhurried, but it drew every eye in the room. He did not say a word. He simply walked over and stood between the miners and the family. He was not a big man, but he was built of whipcord and steel, and he moved with a predator's grace. "Their business is with the bartender," Caleb said, his voice flat and cold. "Not with you." The leader of the miners, a burly man with a red, bloated face, laughed. "And who are you to tell us our business, stranger?" Caleb's eyes met his. They were empty of fear, empty of anger, empty of everything but a chilling resolve. "I'm the man telling you to let them pass." For a long moment, the saloon was dead silent, the tension thick enough to choke on. The miner looked at Caleb, at his worn holster and the calm, steady hands resting at his sides. He saw no bluff there. With a curse, he spat on the floor and stepped aside. "This ain't over," he growled. "It is for tonight," Caleb replied, his gaze never wavering until the family was safely out the door. He turned and walked back to his table, picked up his beer, and finished it in one long swallow. The room slowly came back to life, but the whispers had changed. They were about him now. From a second-story window in the house next to the church, Evelyn Marsh had watched it all. The lamplight from the saloon spilled out onto the street, painting the scene in stark relief. She had seen the family hurry away, the mother clutching her child's hand. She had seen the angry miners stumble out moments later, and she had seen the tall stranger emerge last, melting back into the shadows as if he had never been there at all. Her father preached about righteousness, about standing against evil, but his words were hollow. She had just seen a man live them, and he had done it without a single mention of God. A knot of something unfamiliar, admiration, perhaps, or a dangerous sort of hope, tightened in her chest. Caleb did not have to wait long for the town's official response. The next afternoon, the sheriff found him at the livery. He was a portly man with a stained vest and a face that had surrendered to gravity. He did not look like a man of the law. He looked like a man who took orders. "Thorne," he said, avoiding Caleb's eyes. "I'm told you caused a disturbance last night." "I'm told I ended one," Caleb corrected him. "In Blackridge, we handle our own affairs," the sheriff said, his voice taking on a rehearsed authority. "We don't take kindly to outsiders stirring up trouble. Folks are saying you're a dangerous man."
"Folks can say what they like."
The sheriff finally met his gaze, and Caleb saw the flicker of fear there. "This is your only warning. Reverend Marsh wants a peaceful town. He suggests you find your peace somewhere else. Disappear. It would be healthier." Caleb simply nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. The threat was clear. He was a problem, and the Reverend had ways of making problems go away. He needed a place to stay, somewhere out from under the direct eye of the Reverend and his sheriff. He found it a mile out of town, a small, struggling homestead owned by a widow named Sarah Beckett. Her husband had died in a mine collapse a year prior, leaving her with a teenage son, Jacob, and a collection of fences that were falling apart faster than they could be mended. She looked at Caleb with weary but discerning eyes. "I don't have much to offer, just a cot in the barn and a place at our table." "I'm not looking for much," Caleb said. "I'm good with my hands. I can fix those fences for you, keep your stock from wandering." Sarah agreed. She had heard the rumors about him, but she had also heard from the Mexican family what he had done for them. She decided to trust her own judgment over the town's fearful gossip. Caleb set to work. The labor was hard and honest, a welcome change from the coil of vengeance tightening inside him. He worked alongside Jacob, a quiet, hard-working boy who worshipped the stranger's quiet competence. They dug new post holes, stretched new wire, and slowly, the perimeter of the small ranch began to look whole again. He was building something, protecting something, and it felt right. He rarely spoke of his past, and Sarah and Jacob learned not to ask. His silence was a wall, and they respected it. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the only sound was the wind sighing through the barn, the wall would crumble. He would lie on his cot and think of Ethan, of his bright, easy laugh and the foolish trust he had placed in the wrong man. Guilt was a constant companion, a bitter taste in the back of his throat. He had been away, chasing a herd of cattle south, when Ethan had been arrested, tried, and hanged. He had not been there to protect his younger brother, and the failure haunted his every waking moment. A few days later, seeking a moment of quiet to clear his head, Caleb walked to the small, wind-swept graveyard on the hill overlooking the town. It was a lonely place, dotted with crooked wooden crosses and weathered stones. He stopped when he saw a lone figure kneeling by a grave near the edge of the cemetery. It was Evelyn Marsh. She did not hear him approach. She was carefully arranging a small bunch of wildflowers, their vibrant purples and yellows a stark defiance against the brown, dusty earth. The grave was small, marked only by a simple field stone with no name. He saw her shoulders shake with a silent sob. He should have turned and walked away, left her to her private grief, but he found himself standing there, his boots rooted to the spot. He made a small sound, clearing his throat, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, her eyes wide and startled, tear tracks glistening on her pale cheeks. She quickly wiped them away with the back of her hand, a flush of embarrassment coloring her face. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Miss Marsh," he replied, removing his hat. It felt like the proper thing to do. "I apologize. I didn't mean to intrude." "You are not intruding," she said, her gaze dropping back to the grave. It's a public place." An awkward silence stretched between them, filled only by the wind. "It's my mother's," she said suddenly, as if the silence was too heavy to bear. "She died when I was a little girl. My father, he does not believe in markers. He says vanity has no place in death. but I did not want her to be forgotten. Caleb looked from the small, unmarked grave to the enormous white church that dominated the town below. "Some things ought to be remembered," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. She looked at him then, really looked at him. She saw the lines of weariness around his eyes, the scar that cut a thin white line through his left eyebrow. He was not handsome in the way of city men, but his face had a strength to it, a history carved into the planes of his cheeks and the set of his jaw. "Why are you here, Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "In Blackridge. It is not a place men come to by accident." He thought of Ethan, of Silas Croft, of the justice he had come to deliver. "I'm looking for a man who owes a debt." "A debt of money?" Caleb's eyes darkened for a moment. "Something like that." He shifted his weight, the leather of his gun belt creaking. "I should let you be." He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Thank you," she said. He looked back, a question in his eyes. "In the saloon," she clarified, her cheeks flushing again. "For that family. No one has ever done that here before." He just gave a short, stiff nod and walked away, leaving her alone with her flowers and her ghosts. When Evelyn returned to the parsonage, her father was waiting for her in his study. The room was dark, the curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. He sat behind his large oak desk, his hands steepled before him, his face a mask of cold fury. Silas Croft stood by the door, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He must have seen them. "Where have you been, Evelyn?" Reverend Marsh asked, his voice deceptively calm. "To the cemetery, Father, to visit Mother's resting place." "And you were not alone," he stated. It was not a question. "You were seen speaking with the stranger, the violent man, the troublemaker." "We only exchanged a few words," Evelyn said, her voice trembling slightly. "It was nothing." "It was everything," he thundered, slamming his hand on the desk. He rose and came around the desk, his shadow swallowing her. "You are my daughter. You are a symbol in this town of purity, of obedience. Your name must be beyond reproach. To be seen with a man like that, you have shamed me. You have shamed this house." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. "You will not leave this house without my permission again. You will spend the next 2 days in your room, praying for forgiveness for your lapse in judgment." He pushed her toward the door. "Go. Meditate on your sin." Evelyn fled to her room, not with a feeling of sin, but with a hot, burning ember of rebellion glowing in her chest. His punishment was not for her soul. It was for his reputation, and for the first time, she truly hated him for it. The rumors about Caleb grew wilder. He was a killer, an outlaw, a man who had left a trail of bodies behind him. The fear the Reverend fostered made him a convenient scapegoat, a devil to distract from the town's real problems. Curiosity gnawed at Evelyn. For 2 days, locked in her room, she thought of him. She thought of his quiet strength in the saloon and his gentle respect at the graveyard. The man she had met did not match the monster from the rumors. She had to know why. Why did they fear him so much? What was it about his stillness that so unnerved the loud, blustering men who ran her town? On the 3rd night, she could bear it no longer. She waited until the house was silent, until her father's snores echoed from his bedroom. She slipped out of her window, her stockinged feet making no sound on the roof of the porch. She dropped lightly to the soft earth below and ran, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, all the way to the Beckett Ranch. She found him in the barn, mending a bridle by the soft, golden light of a single lantern. The air smelled of hay and leather. He looked up as she stepped through the doorway, his hand instinctively dropping to the colt at his hip before he recognized her. His face hardened, a mask of polite neutrality falling into place. "Miss Marsh," he said, his voice low and devoid of welcome. "You should not be here." "I had to come," she said, her breath coming in short gasps. She stood in the center of the barn, clutching her shawl around her, looking small and out of place. The things they say about you. I wanted to see for myself. I want to understand what makes you so feared. Caleb slowly put down the bridle and stood up. He did not move closer to her. He kept a careful distance, his posture rigid. He looked at her, at the flush on her cheeks from the run, at the defiant spark in her gray eyes. He saw her youth, her innocence, and the gilded bars of the cage she was so desperate to escape. And he knew, with a certainty that settled in his gut like a cold stone, that he could not be the one to help her. He was poison to a girl like her. "There is nothing to understand. Miss Marsh," he said, his voice flat and formal. "I'm just a man passing through. You should go home before your father discovers you are missing." His words were a dismissal, as cold and sharp as a winter wind. He offered her nothing, no explanation, no kindness, no hint of the man she had glimpsed at the graveyard. He gave her only polite, impenetrable respect. Evelyn stared at him, a storm of emotions warring within her. She had risked so much to come here, to seek some kind of connection, some kind of truth, and he had turned her away with the courtesy one would show a stranger on the street. A hot wave of frustration and disappointment washed over her. Without another word, she turned and fled into the night. Caleb watched her go, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He stood there long after she was gone, listening to the sound of the wind, the only sound in the vast, lonely darkness. He had done the right thing, the honorable thing, but it felt like tearing out a part of himself he had not even known was there. The dust of Blackridge settled into a routine. Caleb worked from sunup to sundown at the Beckett Ranch, the simple, honest labor a balm for his restless soul. He repaired the windmill, reshod the horses, and helped Jacob clear a new pasture. In the evenings, he would sit on the porch with Sarah and her son, the three of them forming a small, quiet circle of trust. He learned from them, and from the hushed conversations he overheard on his rare trips into town for supplies, the true nature of the sickness that afflicted Blackridge. Reverend Marsh preached about the sanctity of the land, but it was a sermon with a price. His right-hand man, Silas Croft, along with a few hired thugs, were the collectors. They would visit the small homesteads that dotted the arid plains around the town, men and women who were barely scratching a living from the unforgiving soil. They would talk of the drought, of the failing wells, of the will of God. Then they would make an offer, a pittance from the Great Western Mining Company for a deed to the land. When piety failed, threats followed. When threats failed, violence was the final verse. Caleb saw the pattern, a slow, methodical strangling of the poor and the weak, all sanctioned from the pulpit. It was a holy crusade of greed, and Silas Croft was its chief apostle. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. The Miller family owned a small plot of land a few miles north of the Beckett place. Tom Miller was a good man, stubborn and proud. With a wife named Mary and 2 small children, their well was nearly dry. But their hope was not. Caleb had shared a cup of coffee with Tom just a week before, listening to his plans to dig a new well, to hold on until the rains came. That afternoon, a cloud of dust on the horizon announced the arrival of Croft and his men. Caleb was on a low ridge, checking a section of fence, when he saw the riders descend on the Miller homestead. He tethered his horse and crept closer, keeping to the cover of the rocks. He heard the shouting first, Croft's oily voice twisting Tom's hope into foolishness. Then the hard crack of knuckles against bone. He saw them drag Tom out of his small sod house. They beat him while his wife screamed and his children cried, their thin wails lost in the vast, indifferent landscape. They beat him until he stopped moving, leaving him a broken heap in the dust of his own yard. Then they set a torch to his small barn. The message was clear. This land was no longer yours. From the road, another witness watched in horror. Evelyn Marsh, chaperoned on a ride into town by one of her father's deacons, had seen the riders and pulled her horse to a stop. She saw the violence, the raw, brutal injustice of it. And something inside her snapped. She screamed at the deacon to intervene, to do something. "It is not our place. Miss Evelyn," the man said, his face pale. "The Reverend knows what is best." "Best for whom?" she cried, trying to urge her horse forward, but the deacon grabbed her reins, his face a mask of grim duty. He turned her horse around and led her back to the parsonage, a prisoner being returned to her cell. Her father met her at the door, his face a thundercloud. He had already heard. "You would make a public spectacle. You would question the actions of men doing the Lord's work." "That was not God's work, Father," Evelyn said, her voice shaking with a fury she had never known. "That was evil." For her defiance, he struck her across the face, the first time he had ever laid a hand on her in anger. The sting was sharp, but the shock was worse. "You are a child, and you know nothing of the world," he snarled. "You will remain in your room until you have repented for this insolence. You will not leave this house again unless I am by your side." He locked her in her room, the sound of the key turning in the lock a final, damning sentence. That night, Caleb went to the Miller place. The barn was a smoldering ruin, the smell of burnt hay and shattered dreams thick in the air. He found Mary Miller huddled with her children in the dark corners of the house, her husband's unconscious form lying on a pallet. She was a woman hollowed out by fear. "He is alive," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "But they will be back to finish the job." Caleb's face was grim in the moonlight. "They will not find you here." He worked quickly, his movements quiet and efficient. He hitched the Millers' single sway-backed horse to their wagon, loading it with what little they had left. He helped Mary get her children and her broken husband settled amongst the blankets. Then, he led the wagon out into the desert, following the hidden arroyos and game trails he had learned, moving like a ghost under the cold light of the stars. He took them 20 miles south, to a little used trail that led toward the next territory. He gave Mary all the money he had, save for a few dollars. "It is not much," he said. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at the tall, quiet stranger who had appeared out of her darkest hour. "God bless you, Mr. Thorne." Caleb just nodded, his throat tight. He watched them disappear into the darkness, another family broken and scattered by the greed of powerful men. He rode back to the Beckett Ranch with a cold, hard rage burning in his chest, a rage that felt dangerously familiar. He spent the rest of the night in the barn, unable to sleep. The image of Tom Miller's beaten body was superimposed over another, older image, a memory that was never far from the surface. He was back in Texas, 5 years ago. He was sitting by a campfire, reading a letter that had taken 2 months to find him. The paper was worn and smudged, but the words were stark and clear. His brother, Ethan, was dead, hanged for stealing a horse he had not stolen. Ethan, who was all laughter and easy smiles, who saw the good in everyone, even when it was not there. Ethan, who had trusted a man named Silas Croft to hold his wages for him, only to have that same man testify that Ethan had paid for the stolen horse with that very money. Caleb remembered the guilt, a physical force that had buckled his knees. He had been the older brother, the protector, but he had been gone, chasing a paycheck. When Ethan had needed him most, he had not been there to see the lie in Croft's eyes, to speak for his brother's character, to stop the inevitable, unjust machinery of the law. He had failed the one person he had sworn to always protect. The guilt was a shadow that lived inside him, a constant reminder of his failure. It was why he had drifted for 5 years, why he had come to Black Ridge, and why he kept a wall of ice around his heart. He would not, could not, be responsible for bringing harm to another innocent, especially not one with sad, gray eyes, who looked at him with a desperate, misplaced hope. For a week, Evelyn was a prisoner in her own home. She saw no one but the stern-faced housekeeper who brought her meals, and her father, who would stand in her doorway and deliver sermons on the virtue of filial piety, but his words were meaningless now. She had seen the truth of his piety in the dust of the miller's yard. The ember of rebellion in her chest had been fanned into a flame. She had to do something. She had to speak to the one man in this town who seemed to understand what justice meant. She wrote a short, simple note on a scrap of paper torn from a book. "I must speak with you. Alone, please." She bribed the stable boy, a shy youth who feared the reverend but pitied his daughter, with a small silver locket that had been her mother's. He slipped the note to Caleb the next time he was in town for supplies. Caleb read the note. His brow furrowed. His first instinct was to burn it, to ignore it. She was trouble, the kind of trouble that could get them both killed. She was the daughter of the man he was here to destroy, but he could not ignore the desperation in her handwriting. He remembered the look on her face at the graveyard, a loneliness that mirrored his own, against his better judgment. He sent a verbal message back with the boy. "The church, tonight, after the bell tolls midnight." The church was a different place at night, without the congregation, without her father's booming voice. It was just a large, empty hall filled with shadows and the faint smell of lemon oil and old paper. The moonlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, painting silver rectangles on the wooden floor. Caleb was waiting for her in the back pew, a dark shape in the deeper darkness. He rose as she slipped in through a side door, her heart hammering against her ribs. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be swallowed by the cavernous space. "The mistake," she replied, her voice shaking but firm, "is doing nothing." She walked toward him, stopping a few feet away. In the pale light, her face was a portrait of desperate resolve. "I saw what happened to the Millers. I saw what you did for them. The stable boy told me." "That has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," she insisted, her voice rising. "My father uses this place, this building, to justify that cruelty. He stands at that pulpit and speaks of God, and then he sends men to beat and terrorize his neighbors. And I am supposed to stand beside him and be a symbol of his goodness. I cannot do it anymore. Mr. Thorne, I will not." She took another step closer, her hands clenched. "Everyone in this town treats me like I am a china doll on a shelf. I am to be protected and admired and kept under glass. I am Reverend Marsh's daughter, a testament to his purity. But I am not a symbol. I am a person, and I want to live. I do not just want to be kept safe." Her words were a torrent, a dam of silence and sorrow breaking apart. She was pleading with him, trying to make him understand the suffocation of her life. Caleb listened, his face an unreadable mask. He saw her fire, her courage, and it terrified him more than any hired gun. He saw her standing on the edge of a cliff, and his every instinct screamed to pull her back, to keep her safe from a fall he was sure was coming. He had to make her see the danger. He had to push her away, for her own good. "You do not know what you are saying," he said, his voice deliberately cold. "You are a preacher's daughter in a town that he owns. You are safe. You have a home. You have a future." He took a breath, steeling himself. "You are still just a girl. You do not understand how this world works." The word struck her like a physical blow. Just a girl. It was what her father always said. It was the dismissal she had heard her entire life. It was the cage, and he was helping to lock the door. The hope that had carried her here died in a flash of hurt and anger. Her hand moved before she even thought about it. The crack of her palm against his cheek echoed in the silent church. Caleb did not flinch. He just stood there, the red mark on his face stark in the moonlight. He had deserved it. Tears of frustration and shame welled in Evelyn's eyes. She turned and ran, her sob muffled by the heavy oak doors as she fled back into the night, leaving him alone in the hollow sanctity of her father's church. 2 nights later, Caleb found her. He had been unable to settle, the memory of her tear-streaked face haunting him. He rode out from the ranch with no destination in mind, letting his horse wander the moonlit trails. He found her a few miles from town, sitting on a rock, her shoulders slumped in exhaustion, A small bundle of belongings lay beside her. She was wearing a simple traveling dress, now smudged with dirt. She had been walking for hours. He swung down from his horse, his movements slow and careful, as if approaching a frightened colt. "Evelyn," he said, using her first name without thinking. She looked up, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. "He was going to marry me off," she said, her voice a raw whisper. "To Silas Croft. He told me it was a suitable match, a way to ensure my purity. He was selling me, like a piece of property, to that man." She stood up, stumbling, and before Caleb could react, she was clinging to him, her face buried in the rough fabric of his shirt, her body racked with shuddering sobs. She felt small and fragile in his arms. Every instinct in him wanted to hold her, to comfort her, to pull her close and absorb her pain into himself. His arms ached with the need to wrap around her. But he did not. He stood rigid, his hands at his sides, his body a wall of resistance. He could feel the warmth of her through his shirt, smell the scent of lavender and dust in her hair. It was a sweet, agonizing torture. He was the reason she was out here, a spark of defiance he had unwittingly fanned. He was the danger he had tried to warn her about. He could not, would not, take advantage of her fear and desperation. He would not be another man who failed to protect an innocent. He gently, firmly, put his hands on her shoulders and pushed her back, keeping her at arm's length. She looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes searching his face, confused by his rejection. "I cannot," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. He looked away, at the vast, star-filled sky, anywhere but at her face. "But I will not leave you out here." He looked back at her then, his blue eyes holding an intensity that made her breath catch. He made a vow, to her and to the ghost of his brother that was always with him. "I will keep you safe," he said, his voice low and certain. "I will not touch you. I will not harm you. You will be a woman grown, and you will make your own choices. In your own time, I will wait. You will be safe with me, no matter what." The promise hung in the cold night air between them, a shield and a comfort. It was a promise of protection, but it was also a confession of a feeling so deep and dangerous he could only speak its name through denial. He helped her onto his horse, then swung up behind her, his body careful not to press against hers. He took her to the widow's ranch, the warm lights of the small house, a beacon in the darkness. Sarah Beckett opened the door, her face etched with concern. She looked from Caleb's grim expression to the exhausted, tear-stained girl he held, and she understood without a word being spoken. She opened her arms and led Evelyn inside, into the warmth and the light, away from the darkness that was surely to follow. Caleb stood on the porch, a solitary guardian, as the whispers of gossip and the storm of scandal began to gather on the horizon. Blackridge was a town that thrived on whispers, and the news of the preacher's daughter running away to a renegade cowboy's camp was a feast. The story spread faster than a prairie fire, each telling adding another layer of sin and sordid detail. Caleb Thorne was no longer just a troublemaker. He was a serpent in their Eden, a silver-tongued devil who had charmed the pure, innocent Evelyn Marsh from her father's holy protection. He was a seducer, a kidnapper, a threat to the virtue of every woman and daughter in town. From his pulpit, Reverend Marsh did not quell the rumors. He watered them like seeds. He spoke of wolves in sheep's clothing, of the sacred duty to protect the flock from predators, his voice ringing with the righteous fury of a wronged father, his eyes burning with the cold calculation of a man turning a scandal to his advantage. At the Beckett Ranch, life settled into a tense and fragile rhythm, an island of quiet defiance in a sea of condemnation. For Evelyn, it was like learning to breathe a new kind of air. The soft, useless hands that had only ever known embroidery needles and the keys of a piano were now plunged into the raw reality of survival. She tried to help Sarah in the kitchen and burned her arm on the cast-iron stove. She tried to milk the cow and ended up with more on her dress than in the pail, her hands clumsy and stinging from the unfamiliar work. Her biscuits were hard as rocks. Her stitches on a mended shirt were crooked and bunched. Every small failure was a fresh sting of humiliation, a reminder of the ornamental life she had fled. But within her, a stubborn core of determination hardened with each new day. She was not a guest. She would not be a burden. She rose before the sun with Sarah, her body aching with a fatigue she had never known, and she worked until her muscles screamed. She learned to knead dough with a firm hand, to churn butter, to pluck a chicken without flinching. She learned the satisfaction of a well-scrubbed floor and the simple beauty of a row of vegetables weeded by her own hand. Slowly, painstakingly, she was earning her place, not just on the ranch, but in her own skin. Through it all, Caleb was a constant, distant presence. He held to his promise with a discipline that was both a comfort and a torment. He was a wall of polite respect she could not breach. He spoke to her in formal tones, calling her Miss Marsh, his eyes never quite meeting hers for more than a fleeting moment. He kept a careful physical distance, always ensuring Jacob or Sarah were between them. If she reached for a tool and their hands accidentally brushed, he would pull back as if he had been burned. But she saw. She was a student of silence, raised in a house where the most important things were never spoken aloud. She saw the way his eyes would follow her when he thought she was not looking. A flicker of raw, unguarded emotion in their blue depths before the mask of indifference slammed back into place. She saw the tightening of his jaw when another man, a neighboring rancher stopping by for business, paid her a simple compliment. She saw the way his hands, resting on the porch rail, would clench into white-knuckled fists when he listened to Jacob tell a story that made her laugh. He was suffering, and he was suffering for her. His promise to keep her safe was a cage he had built for himself, and he paced its confines like a trapped wolf. He was denying what simmered between them, a tangible thing that thickened the air whenever they were in the same room. And her frustration with his distance began to mingle with a deep, aching tenderness. He was not rejecting her. He was protecting her, even from himself. The realization did not lessen her longing, but it deepened her respect, and with it, her love. The quiet standoff could not last. The anger in the town, stoked daily by the Reverend, was bound to boil over. It happened on a moonless night, a week after Evelyn's arrival. The first sign was the distant barking of a neighbor's dog, a frantic, insistent sound that carried on the wind. Then came another sound, a low rumble of angry voices and the sinister flicker of torchlight moving across the dark plain. Caleb was on the porch in an instant, Jacob at his side. "Get your mother and Evelyn into the root cellar," he ordered the boy, his voice low and calm, but with an edge of tempered steel. "Bar the door from the inside and do not come out, no matter what you hear." He stepped back into the house and emerged a moment later with his Winchester rifle. He did not check to see if it was loaded. It was always loaded. He moved to the edge of the porch, a lone, dark silhouette against the warm lamplight spilling from the house, and waited. They came out of the darkness like specters, a dozen of them, their faces twisted with drink and self-righteousness. Silas Croft was at their head, his face smug in the flickering torchlight. A few of them carried ropes. "Thorne!" Croft yelled, his voice slurring slightly. "We have come for the girl. The Reverend wants his daughter back." "She is not here," Caleb said, his voice carrying easily in the tense silence. It was a lie, flat and simple. "We know she is," another man shouted. "We will not let a devil like you corrupt a sweet, innocent child." Caleb raised the rifle, the motion fluid and unhurried, settling the stock against his shoulder. He did not aim it at any one man, but at the center of the mob, a gesture that included them all. "The only devils I see are the ones standing in my yard, threatening a widow and her boy. This is private property. I am telling you once to turn around and go home." His stillness was more menacing than any threat. He did not shout. He did not waver. He was a rock, and they were a wave of angry water that would break against him. "He is just one man," Croft sneered, trying to rally his courage. He took a step forward. The hammer of the Winchester clicked back. The sound was small, but it cut through the night with the sharp finality of a closing coffin lid. "Take another step," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. "And you will find out if your faith is strong enough to stop a bullet." For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. The men in the mob looked at each other, the drunken bravado draining from their faces. They looked at the rifle, steady and certain in Caleb's hands, and at the unblinking resolve in his eyes. They saw a man who had nothing left to lose, a man who would not hesitate, one by one. They began to back away, melting back into the darkness that had spawned them. Silas Croft was the last to leave, his face a mask of impotent fury. "This is not over, Thorn!" he spat. "It will be," Caleb replied to the empty darkness. He stayed on the porch for another hour, the rifle resting in the crook of his arm, until he was certain they were gone. The mob had failed, so the Reverend sent the law. The next afternoon, Sheriff Blevins rode out to the ranch alone. He dismounted, his face sweating under the hot sun, and refused Sarah's offer of a glass of water. He was here on official business. He faced Caleb on the porch, his eyes shifting nervously. "Caleb Thorne," he began, puffing out his chest to lend himself an authority he did not possess. "I have a warrant here for your arrest." "On what charge?" Caleb asked, his face impassive. "The charge is corrupting a minor," the sheriff said, the words sounding rehearsed. "Reverend Marsh has filed a complaint. He claims you have abducted his daughter, Evelyn, who is not yet of legal age, and are holding her here against her will for immoral purposes." Caleb's eyes went cold. The lie was so vile, so perfectly crafted to twist his protection into something monstrous, that for a moment he could not speak. "Now," the sheriff continued, gaining confidence, "the Reverend is a merciful man. He does not wish to see this town torn apart by a scandalous trial. He has authorized me to make you an offer. If you leave the county within 2 days, and the girl is returned to him, he will drop the charges." He paused for effect. "If you are still here on the 3rd day, I will come back with a posse, and I will drag you to jail in chains." He had delivered his message. He turned and lumbered back to his horse, not waiting for a reply. The ultimatum had been given. The trap had been set. That evening, the air in the small ranch house was thick with unspoken fear. Sarah and Jacob knew the danger they were all in. Evelyn knew that she was the cause of it. Caleb sat at the table, staring at the scarred wood, his mind a whirlwind. He could fight. He could stand his ground and likely kill the sheriff and a few of his men when they came, but the end result would be the same. He would be dead or in chains, and Evelyn would be dragged back to her father. The widow and her son would lose their home. Or worse, he had brought this storm down upon them, and he could see only one way to lead it away. He looked up and met Evelyn's gaze across the table. Her eyes were wide with fear, not for herself, but for him. "Sarah," he said, his voice heavy, "tomorrow morning, I need you to take Evelyn away from here. Head south. There is an old mission trail about 30 miles out. You can follow it to the next territory. Find a town, a real town, and get word to her aunt in St. Louis. I will give you the address. You can send a telegram from there." The silence that followed was broken by Evelyn's sharp intake of breath. "No," she whispered. "It is the only way," Caleb said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He would not look at her. He kept his eyes on Sarah. "It is not safe for her here anymore. It is not safe for any of you."
"And what about you?"
Sarah asked, her voice thick with worry. "I will handle the sheriff," he said grimly. "I will lead them off." give you time to get clear." "No," Evelyn said, her voice stronger now. She stood up, her chair scraping against the floorboards. "I will not run. I will not leave you here to face them alone." "You do not have a choice," Caleb said, his voice flat and final. He stood up as well, turning to face her. "The decision is made." Tears welled in her eyes, the first he had ever seen her shed. They traced shimmering paths down her dusty cheeks. This was not the frustrated, angry outburst in the church. This was the sound of a heart breaking. "You have no right to make that choice for me," she pleaded, her voice cracking. She took a step toward him, her hands reaching out as if to touch him, then falling back to her sides. "All my life, men have been making choices for me. My father, the sheriff, and now you. You promise me I will be a woman grown and make my own choices. And then you treat me like a child to be sent away for her own good." The tears were flowing freely now, but her voice grew stronger, fueled by the pain of his decision. "Do you not see? I do not care if it is safe. I would rather stand here and face them with you than be safe 1,000 miles away without you." She took another step, closing the distance between them until she was standing right before him, tilting her head back to look up into his tortured face. "Do not give up on me, Caleb," she whispered, her voice raw with love and desperation. "Please, I do not want to be protected anymore." She reached up and placed a trembling hand on his chest, right over his heart. "I want you." Her touch was a brand, burning through his shirt, through his skin, searing itself onto his very soul. Her words were the ones he had longed to hear and prayed she would never say. For one agonizing moment, he almost broke. His hands rose, wanting to pull her to him, to hold her, to finally give in to the fierce, aching love that was suffocating him. He could feel her heart hammering against his hand, her warm breath on his chin. But then he saw it all in a flash. The sheriff's posse. The gunfire. Her face streaked with terror as they dragged him away. He saw her forced back to her father, forced to marry a man like Croft, her spirit broken, her light extinguished forever. His promise, his vow to keep her safe, was the only thing he had left to cling to. He closed his eyes, his face a mask of anguish. "I cannot," he whispered, the words tearing from his throat. He took her hand from his chest, his fingers wrapping around hers for one brief, painful moment before he let it go. He turned and walked out of the house, away from her, away from the temptation and the heartbreak, and did not look back. The next morning, under a gray, unforgiving sky, he helped Sarah hitch the wagon. Evelyn emerged from the house, her face pale and her eyes swollen, a small bundle in her hands. She did not look at him. She allowed Jacob to help her onto the wagon seat, her movements stiff and wooden. Caleb stood by his horse, his own saddlebags packed. He would ride out in the opposite direction, draw them away. He watched as Sarah took the reins and clucked to the horse. The wagon lurched forward, its wheels creaking a mournful protest. It rolled past him, down the dusty track that led away from the ranch, away from him. He watched until it was just a small, dark shape on the horizon, until the dust settled and there was nothing left but the empty road. Only then did the iron control he held over himself finally shatter. A sound, a raw, ragged cry of pure animal grief, was torn from his chest. He stumbled back against a fence post, his legs unable to hold him, and slid to the ground. He buried his face in his hands, his whole body shaking with the force of his silent sobs. He had sent away the only light that had pierced the darkness of his life, and he had never felt so alone. That night, he sat in the cold, empty barn, the silence a deafening roar in his ears. By the light of a single lantern, he pulled a small, worn leather pouch from his saddlebags. Inside were a dozen or so letters, their paper yellowed and folded into small, neat squares. Ethan's letters, full of bad jokes and big dreams, and a brother's uncomplicated love. He had carried them for 5 years, a penance, a physical manifestation of his guilt. He opened one and read the familiar scrawl, the words blurring through the fresh grief that burned in his eyes. He had failed Ethan. He had just failed Evelyn. He had tried to protect them both by staying away, by keeping his distance, and he had lost them anyway. His grief was a cold, dead weight, but as he sat there in the darkness, something began to shift inside him. The sorrow began to curdle, to harden, to sharpen into something else. The passive weight of his guilt became an active, burning rage. He had been running, hiding behind a wall of honor and denial for too long. He had let evil men dictate the terms. No more. One by one, he took the letters, his brother's last words on earth, and dropped them into the lantern's flame. He watched the edges curl and blacken, the words turning to ash and smoke. He was not destroying the memory of his brother. He was releasing himself from the prison of his guilt. He was transforming his grief into a weapon. When the last letter was gone, Caleb Thorne stood up. The sorrow in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, clear, and deadly purpose. His face, illuminated by the lonely flame, was the face of a man who was done waiting for justice. He was going to drag it, kicking and screaming, into the light. Caleb Thorne rode back into Blackridge not like a man returning to a fight, but like a man who owned the battlefield. The furtive caution was gone, burned away in the fire that had consumed his brother's letters. In its place was a cold, hard clarity that settled in his eyes and straightened his spine. He did not skirt the edges of town. He rode straight down the main street in the hard light of midday, his horse's hooves beating a slow, deliberate rhythm on the packed earth. He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office and did not bother to tether his horse. He would not be staying long. Sheriff Blevins was at his desk, his feet propped up, a half-eaten apple in his hand. He looked up as Caleb's shadow fell across him, and the color drained from his face. He fumbled his feet to the floor. "Thorne, what in blazes are you doing here? I gave you 2 days. I could arrest you right now." "Go ahead," Caleb said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of granite. He stopped in the middle of the small room, his hands loose at his sides. "Arrest me. Put me in your cell. It will not stop what is coming." "What are you talking about? You are a wanted man." "I am a man who is tired of watching good people get broken," Caleb corrected him. "I am here about the Millers, and the Jacksons before them, and the Ortegas before them. I want to know why the county sheriff is letting a mining company, with the help of a preacher's hired thugs, steal land from its rightful owners." The sheriff sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "Those are lies. Slander. The Reverend is a man of God. Those people sold their land fair and square." "There is nothing fair about a man signing over his deed with a gun to his head," Caleb said. "And there is nothing square about the county land registry having 2 different deeds on file for the same plot, one with a forged signature." Blevins froze, his mouth half open. Caleb was bluffing, but it was a calculated one, aimed at the weakest link in the chain. "You are the law in this town, Blevins," Caleb continued, taking a slow step forward. "That means you have a choice. You can do your job and investigate what is happening under your nose, or you can keep taking the preacher's blood money and wait for a federal marshal to come here and ask you why you did not. When that day comes, I promise you, the Reverend Marsh will feed you to the wolves to save his own skin." He held the sheriff's gaze for a long moment, letting the words sink in. He saw the flicker of fear, the dawning realization in the man's eyes that his comfortable arrangement was about to implode. Without another word, Caleb turned and walked out, leaving the sheriff to stew in the poison of his own corruption. He now needed proof. For 2 days, Caleb moved like a ghost through the town's periphery. He spoke to the families who had not yet been driven out, gathering their stories, their fears. He learned that all the transactions, all the deed transfers, went through the town clerk's office, a stuffy little room in the back of the general store run by a nervous, bespectacled man named Henry Gable. Caleb cornered him one evening as he was locking up. Gable nearly jumped out of his skin when Caleb stepped out of the shadows. "I do not want any trouble," Gable stammered, fumbling with his keys. "I am not here to make trouble for you, Henry," Caleb said, his voice calm. "I am here to stop it. I know you have seen the deeds. I know you have seen the signatures that do not match. I have seen the terror in the eyes of the women and children whose homes are being stolen. You have, too." Gable avoided his eyes, staring at the dusty boardwalk. "The Reverend, he is a powerful man." "He is a man," Caleb said. "Just a man, and men can fall, but you have to ask yourself, when he does, do you want to be the one who stood by and did nothing while your neighbors were cheated, or do you want to be the one who did the right thing?" Caleb left him with that thought. The next night, a package wrapped in brown paper was left for him in the livery stable. Inside was a small, leather-bound ledger. It was the preacher's private record book. Gable had taken the risk. Page after page detailed the paltry sums paid to the landowners, and the much larger sums received from the Great Western Mining Company. It was all there in black and white, the anatomy of a grand theft, blessed by scripture and enforced by violence. Caleb finally had his weapon, miles away, in the deep woods that bordered the desert. Evelyn felt like a prisoner of a different sort. The abandoned line cabin Sarah had led her to was a refuge, a small, sturdy shelter hidden in a stand of pines, but it felt like a cage. Sarah Beckett was kind, treating her with a maternal gentleness she had never known, but every waking moment was a torment of worry. She pictured Caleb facing the sheriff's posse alone, imagined him hurt, or worse. The safety he had bought for her felt like a cowardice she could not bear. "He did this to protect you, child," Sarah told her one evening as they sat by the small fire. "Protection is not living," Evelyn replied, staring into the flames. "He is in danger because of me, Sarah, because I was too weak to stand up to my father. I cannot hide out here in the woods while he fights a battle that should be mine." A fierce, restless energy hummed beneath her skin. The girl who had been afraid of her own shadow was gone. In her place was a woman who knew what she wanted, and she was no longer willing to wait for someone to give it to her. Her father, meanwhile, made his next move. When his daughter did not reappear and Caleb Thorne did not flee, Reverend Marsh played his trump card. From the pulpit that Sunday, he delivered a sermon of fire and brimstone, painting Caleb as a demon sent to test their flock. He officially accused Caleb of kidnapping his daughter and, for good measure, of horse theft and robbery. Then, he announced that he and the mining company were offering a bounty of $500 for the capture of Caleb Thorne, dead or alive. The news traveled fast. Suddenly, Blackridge was crawling with hard-faced men with hungry eyes, bounty hunters drawn by the smell of easy money. Caleb was no longer just dealing with the sheriff. He was now the prey in a town full of predators. He knew he had to lie low, to choose his moment. He had taken to sleeping in the hayloft of the Beckett's barn, coming and going under the cover of darkness. He was planning his final move, how to present the ledger to the right people, perhaps a territorial judge in the next county. He was careless for just a moment. He was riding back to the ranch late one afternoon, taking a narrow trail that cut along the top of a series of rocky cliffs. The sun was low, casting long shadows that played tricks on the eyes. The first shot came without warning, a whip crack of sound that echoed through the canyon. The bullet tore through the cantle of his saddle, and his horse screamed, rearing in terror. The second shot slammed into Caleb's side, a fiery, sledgehammer blow that knocked the breath from his lungs and sent him tumbling from the saddle. He hit the ground hard, his head cracking against a rock. The world exploded in a shower of stars. Through a haze of pain, he saw 3 men emerge from the rocks above, rifles in hand. Bounty hunters? He clawed for his Colt, his side a sheet of fire. His vision was blurring. He managed to fire twice, the sound of the shots deafeningly close. One of the men cried out and fell. The others took cover. Caleb used the precious seconds to crawl. dragging himself behind a cluster of boulders, his blood leaving a dark trail in the dust. The pain was a living thing, a hot poker twisting in his ribs. He knew he was a dead man if he stayed. Below him, the cliff fell away 100 feet, but a steep, scree-covered slope offered a desperate chance, with the remaining bounty hunters firing blindly into the rocks. Caleb pushed off, half sliding, half falling down the treacherous incline, rocks and gravel cascading around him. He landed in a heap at the bottom, hidden in a thicket of manzanita, the world fading to a roaring blackness. Evelyn returned to Blackridge that same night. She could not bear the waiting, the not knowing, any longer. She had left a note for Sarah and slipped away before dawn, walking the long miles back to the only home she had ever known, though she knew she could not go there. She moved through the alleys and back ways of the town like a wraith, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and resolve. She learned about the bounty from the ugly talk she overheard spilling from the saloon. She heard the triumphant story of the ambush at the cliffs, of how Thorne had been shot and surely lay dead or dying at the bottom of the canyon. A cold dread seized her, so powerful it almost stole her breath. But it was quickly followed by a desperate, illogical hope. They said he was dead, but they had not found a body. She knew where he would go. If he was alive, if he could move at all, there was only one place he would feel safe. She ran, heedless of the risk, all the way to the Beckett ranch. The house was dark. She did not dare go to the door. She went to the barn, her sanctuary, the place where she had last seen him. She slipped through the side door into the familiar darkness, the air thick with the smell of hay and animals. "Caleb?" she whispered, her voice a thin, trembling thread. A weak groan answered her from the hayloft. She scrambled up the ladder, her hands shaking. She found him in the far corner, lying on a bed of loose hay, his face pale as death in the moonlight slanting through the loft window. His shirt was soaked with blood. He was barely conscious, working with a frantic, focused energy. She lit one of the oil lamps, its golden glow pushing back the shadows. She found a clean rag and the water bucket. With trembling hands, she cut away his shirt. The wound was ugly, a ragged tear in the flesh high on his left side. It was still oozing blood. He was feverish, his skin hot to the touch. She cleaned the wound as gently as she could, her touch light and sure. He grimaced in his delirium, muttering a name. Ethan. Her heart ached for him, for the pain he held so deep inside. As she worked, a storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke. Rain began to hammer on the tin roof of the barn, a steady, rhythmic drumming that shut out the rest of the world. The wind howled outside, but inside their small pocket of lamplight, there was only the sound of the rain and their breathing. She managed to stop the bleeding and bandaged the wound tightly with strips torn from her petticoat. She propped his head up on a pile of hay and sat beside him, wiping his brow with a cool, damp cloth. For hours, she sat there, watching him, listening to the storm rage outside and the quieter storm inside her own heart. Sometime after midnight, his fever broke, his eyes fluttered open, and for the first time, they were clear. He looked at her, confusion warring with a deep, bone-weary relief.
"Evelyn,"
he rasped, his voice rough. "You should not be here." "And you should not be dying in a hayloft," she replied, her voice soft but steady. She offered him a little water from a dipper, and he drank greedily. He tried to push himself up, but fell back with a sharp hiss of pain. "They will look for me here."
"Let them,"
she said, her gaze never leaving his face.
"We are safe for tonight. The storm will hide our tracks."
He lay back, his breathing shallow. He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes, at the gentle touch of her hand as she straightened the bandage. He saw the woman she had become, strong and brave and so painfully beautiful it stole the air from his lungs. All his walls, all his carefully constructed defenses, crumbled to dust in that moment. In the quiet of the barn, with the rain drumming a soft tattoo on the roof, The space between them was charged with all the things they had never said, all the feelings they had fought to deny. The golden light of the oil lamp cast a warm, intimate glow, cocooning them from the violent world outside. Evelyn leaned closer, her hand moving from his forehead to his cheek, her thumb gently stroking the rough stubble on his jaw. He was so vulnerable, so human. The fierce protector was broken and bleeding, and she had never loved him more. She whispered, her voice husky with emotion, the words a soft counterpoint to the storm. "You said you would wait." He closed his eyes, a tremor running through him. "I did." Her gaze was unwavering, full of a deep, tender certainty.
"But I do not want to wait tonight."
His eyes opened, and he looked at her, a world of anguish and longing in their depths. His hands, which had lain limp at his sides, trembled as he lifted one to her face, his fingers tracing the line of her cheekbone as if she were a vision he was afraid would disappear. "Evelyn." He breathed her name like a prayer and a curse. "I am wounded. I am not. I cannot." He was resisting, fighting the last battle against himself, against the promise he had made to his brother's ghost.
"I am not asking you to be strong,"
she whispered, leaning in until her forehead rested against his. "I am not a girl who needs protecting. I am a woman who is making a choice. I am choosing you, right here, tonight." Her tenderness, her choice, her absolute insistence was the final thing that broke his restraint. The long, lonely years of guilt, the fierce, aching denial, it all washed away in the face of her love. A shuddering breath escaped him, a sound of surrender. With infinite slowness, mindful of his wound, he moved, his hand sliding from her cheek to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair. He drew her down to him, his mouth finding hers. The kiss was not one of hungry passion, but of deep, aching reverence. It was hesitant, unsure, weighted with all the loss and longing they had both endured. It tasted of rain and dust and salt, the salt of tears she did not realize she was weeping. They made love slowly, a silent, clumsy, and beautiful conversation between two scarred souls. It was an act not of possession, but of discovery, of finding a home in a world that had offered them nothing but hardship. It was a gentle claiming, a quiet healing, an anchor in the storm. Every touch was a question, every glance an answer. In the aftermath, they lay tangled in the sweet-smelling hay, his arm wrapped carefully around her, her head resting on his good shoulder. The storm outside had softened to a gentle patter. The oil lamp sputtered, casting dancing shadows on the high rafters. They did not speak. There were no words for the fragile peace that had settled over them. Vulnerable, human, and for the first time in a long time, not entirely alone, they drifted into sleep in each other's arms. The first thing that broke through the warm, fragile shell of their sleep was the smell. It was an acrid, unnatural scent that clawed at the back of the throat, thick with the smell of burning pitch and old wood. Caleb came to consciousness first, his body screaming a protest as he shifted. A wave of pain from his side was instantly overshadowed by a primal, gut-wrenching alarm. He opened his eyes to a terrifying, flickering orange light that danced against the high rafters of the barn. "Evelyn," he said, his voice a harsh rasp. He shook her gently. "Wake up, now." She stirred, her eyes fluttering open, a soft, sleepy smile on her face that vanished as she saw the look in his eyes and the hellish light that illuminated them. The low crackle they had mistaken for the dying rain was now a hungry, roaring sound. Smoke, thick and black, was beginning to pour through the floorboards of the hayloft.
"Fire,"
she breathed, the word stolen by a sudden, violent cough. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her for a heartbeat before a new, unfamiliar resolve took its place. She looked at Caleb, who was struggling to sit up, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his hand clamped to his freshly bandaged side. He was in no condition to escape, let alone help her. Their roles had been irrevocably reversed. "We have to go," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "The ladder." The heat was already intense, a physical presence that pressed in on them. They crawled through the choking smoke to the edge of the loft. Below, the main floor of the barn was an inferno. Flames licked up the support beams and devoured the dry stalls. The ladder was already engulfed, its rungs burning like the rungs of a ladder to hell. There was no way down. "The loading door," Caleb gasped, pointing toward the large double doors at the back of the loft used for hoisting hay. It was their only chance. Evelyn scrambled to the doors, her hands fumbling with the heavy wooden bar that held them shut. It was thick and swollen with humidity, and for a terrifying moment, it would not budge. She threw her entire weight against it, a sob of effort escaping her lips, and with a groan of protesting wood, it finally gave way. She flung the doors open, and a gust of wind and rain rushed in, momentarily pushing back the smoke. They were 15 feet from the ground, a muddy, rain-soaked patch of earth below. It was a dangerous jump, suicidal for a man in Caleb's condition. "There is rope," he said, his voice strained. "By the pulley." Evelyn found the thick rope coiled near the hay bale pulley system. She worked with frantic speed, her fingers surprisingly nimble as she secured one end to a thick support beam. Testing the knot with all her strength, she threw the other end out the door. It dangled in the wind, a thin, fragile lifeline against the backdrop of the raging fire. "You first," she said, turning to help him. He shook his head. "I will not be able to hold on. You go. Get clear of here." "No," she said, her voice fierce. "We are going together, or we are not going at all." She looped the rope under his arms, ignoring his pained hiss. "Hold on to the rope. I will lower you as best I can. Let your feet slide against the wall." There was no time to argue. The roof above them was beginning to groan, and the heat was becoming unbearable. Caleb, his jaw clenched against the searing pain in his side, did as she said. He was a dead weight, and it took every ounce of Evelyn's strength to control his descent. The rope burned her hands, stripping the skin from her palms, but she did not let go. She braced her feet against the floorboards, her muscles screaming, and slowly, foot by agonizing foot, she lowered him to the ground. He collapsed in the mud at the bottom, and she did not wait to see if he was all right. She took a deep breath, wrapped the rope around her own hands, and half climbed, half slid down to join him. She landed hard, her ankle twisting beneath her. A sharp pain shot up her leg, but she ignored it. The entire barn was now a roaring pillar of flame, spitting embers into the dark, rain-swept sky. And then a new horror became apparent. It was not just the barn. The fire had spread to the house. Flames were already consuming the small, tidy home of the woman who had given them sanctuary. "Sarah!" Evelyn cried, stumbling toward the burning house. "Jacob!" Caleb grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "No, it is too late. You will not make it." Just then, the roof of the house collapsed in on itself with a deafening roar, sending a shower of sparks and flaming debris into the night. It was gone. Everything was gone. Sarah Beckett's home, her life, was a funeral pyre. There was no sign of her or her son. Evelyn stared at the ruin, a hollow, empty sickness filling her. Had they been inside? The question was a shard of ice in her heart. As if summoned by the tragedy, riders emerged from the darkness. It was Sheriff Blevins and a half-dozen deputized men, their faces grim in the firelight. They had not come to help. They surrounded Caleb and Evelyn, their guns drawn. "It is over, Thorne," the sheriff said, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. He looked from the burning buildings to Caleb's bloody side, to the raw, burned flesh of Evelyn's hands. "Arson, on top of everything else. You are a dangerous man." "This was not my doing," Caleb said, struggling to his feet with Evelyn's help. It was your preacher's men, Silas Croft. All I see, Blevins said, gesturing with his pistol, is my town's only suspect for kidnapping and robbery, standing over the ashes of a good woman's home.
And where is the boy, Thorne? What did you do with Jacob Beckett?
The accusation was a fresh blow. Jacob was missing, the boy who had looked at him with such open admiration. Caleb's shoulders slumped, the weight of another failure, another life he had been unable to protect, crushing him. They clapped him in chains, the cold iron heavy and final on his wrists. They did not offer Evelyn any aid. They pulled Caleb toward a horse and forced him to walk, stumbling and bleeding. As they rode back to town, he did not look back at Evelyn, standing alone in the rain, a solitary figure illuminated by the dying flames of their brief sanctuary. To look at her would have broken him completely. The ride to town was a blur of pain and humiliation. They dragged him down the main street as the sun began to rise, the few early risers stopping to stare at the captured devil, his clothes torn and blood-stained, his face a mask of grim exhaustion. They threw him into a small, filthy cell in the back of the sheriff's office and left him there without a doctor, without a word. Evelyn, left alone at the smoldering ruins, did not weep. The shock had frozen the tears inside her, a cold, clear rage, the likes of which she had never known, settled in her heart. She walked the long mile back to Blackridge, her twisted ankle throbbing with every step, her burned hands held stiffly at her sides. She did not go to the parsonage. She went to the church. It was Sunday morning. The bell was tolling, calling the good people of the town to worship. She slipped in through the side door and stood at the back, a specter at the feast, her dress smudged with soot, her hair wild and matted. Her father was at the pulpit, his voice resonating through the hushed hall. He was speaking of the fire, of the righteous hand of God striking down the wicked. He was twisting the tragedy into another parable of his own divine authority. He did not see her until she began to walk down the central aisle. A murmur went through the congregation. Heads turned. The people stared, their eyes wide with shock at the sight of her. She was supposed to be a captive, a violated innocent, but the girl walking toward the pulpit looked like neither. Her eyes burned with a holy fire that made her father's seem like a cheap imitation. She stopped at the bottom of the steps to the pulpit and looked up at him. "You are a liar," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the silent church. Reverend Marsh's face went from pious concern to pure fury in an instant. "Evelyn, you are overwrought. Go to my study at once. This is not the place." "This is the only place," she interrupted, her voice gaining strength. She turned to face the congregation, her people, the men and women who had known her since she was a child. "This man, my father, speaks to you of God, but he serves only greed. He told you that Caleb Thorne is a kidnapper and a thief. He is a liar. Caleb Thorne protected me when my own father tried to sell me in marriage to Silas Croft." A gasp went through the crowd. "He told you those ranchers sold their land willingly?" she continued, her voice ringing with the passion of truth. "He is a liar. I saw his men beat Tom Miller senseless and burn his barn to drive him from his home. He has been systematically terrorizing and cheating you, his flock, for months, forging your names on deeds and pocketing the profits from the mining company." She held up her raw, burned hands. "Last night, his men, not Caleb Thorne, burned down the Beckett ranch. Sarah Beckett's home is gone. Her son, Jacob, is missing, and Caleb Thorne, the man who tried to save them, the man who saved me, lies wounded in your jail, accused of my father's crimes." She turned her fiery gaze back to the man on the pulpit. He was speechless, his face mottled with rage. "You speak of devils. Father, you should look in a mirror." She did not wait for his response. She turned and walked back down the aisle, her head held high, through the stunned, murmuring crowd. She had thrown the stone into the placid pool of their obedience, and the ripples were already beginning to spread. The authority of Reverend Josiah Marsh had been cracked. perhaps irrevocably. That night, a figure moved through the shadows behind the sheriff's office. A key, wrapped in a piece of cloth, was slipped through the barred window of Caleb's cell, landing on the straw-covered floor with a soft thud. There was a whispered voice from the darkness. He was right. The preacher would feed me to the wolves. It was Henry Gable, the town clerk, finishing what he had started. Caleb moved with painful slowness. Unlocking the chains and the cell door was an agony, his wounded side screaming with every movement. The wound, untended, had begun to fester. He was weak, feverish, but the thought of Evelyn, of her courage, propelled him forward. He slipped out into the night, a wounded animal seeking cover. He could not stay in town. There was only one place to go, one place he might find a moment's peace to heal. He stumbled toward the woods, toward the abandoned cabin, his vision blurring, leaving a fresh trail of blood in the dirt behind him. Evelyn knew where he would go. As soon as darkness fell, she had gathered what she could. A small sack with bread and cheese stolen from the parsonage kitchen, a bottle of whiskey for antiseptic, and clean bandages. She followed the familiar path into the forest, her heart a cold knot of dread. She found him collapsed not 50 yards from the cabin, unconscious, his breathing shallow. For the second time in as many days, she became his nurse, his savior. She managed to drag him inside the small, dusty cabin, his dead weight an almost impossible burden. She cleaned and redressed his wound, which was inflamed and angry. She forced a little water and whiskey between his lips. For 2 days, he drifted in and out of a feverish delirium. She did not sleep. She watched over him, bathing his face, whispering words of encouragement, willing him to live with every fiber of her being. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. He woke to find her asleep in a chair beside his cot, her face pale with exhaustion, her soot-stained dress torn and ragged. He reached out a weak hand and touched her hair. Her eyes fluttered open. A slow smile of pure, unadulterated relief spread across her face. "You came back," he whispered. "I will always come back," she replied. In the quiet days that followed, as his strength slowly returned, they talked. The walls he had kept around his heart for so long finally came down. He told her everything about Ethan, about his bright, trusting nature, and the bitter, suffocating guilt that had haunted him for 5 years. "I failed him," Caleb said, his voice thick with old pain as they sat by the small hearth. "I was not there, and I was so afraid of failing you, of being the reason you got hurt, that I almost failed you in the same way, by pushing you away." Evelyn listened, her heart aching for the burden he had carried alone for so long. When he was finished, she took his hand. "You did not fail your brother, Caleb. A liar and a cheat did, and you have not failed me. You have shown me what it means to be strong, to be brave. You helped me find a voice I did not know I had." She squeezed his hand. "Now, we use our voices and our strength together." A new understanding settled between them, a partnership forged in fire and pain. The desperation and the denial were gone, replaced by a calm, quiet resolve. "I am done being a symbol," Evelyn said one afternoon, looking at her reflection in a piece of broken mirror she had found. "I am done being the Reverend's daughter." She picked up a knife from the supplies she had gathered. With a few quick, decisive motions, she sawed through her long hair, the honey-colored locks falling to the dirt floor around her feet. When she was done, her hair was short, brushing against her jawline, framing a face that was no longer that of a sheltered girl, but of a determined woman. She found a pair of old trousers and a shirt Jacob had left behind in the cabin. The clothes were too big, but when she put them on, cinching the trousers with a piece of rope, she felt a freedom she had never known. She was no longer Evelyn Marsh, the preacher's daughter. She was just Evelyn. That evening, she walked out of the cabin to find Caleb practicing with his colt, his movements still stiff but growing steadier. He looked at her, at her short hair and her boy's clothes, and a slow, genuine smile touched his lips for the first time. "It seems I am not the only one who has done running," he said.
Teach me,
she said, her voice firm. He looked at her, a question in his eyes.
Teach me how to shoot,
she clarified. "If we are going to stand our ground, I will not do it from behind you. I will do it beside you." He hesitated for only a moment. Then he nodded, a look of profound respect in his eyes. He handed her the heavy pistol, his hand covering hers, showing her how to hold it, how to find her balance, how to look down the sight. Their pact was sealed, not with words, but with the cold, hard weight of steel and the shared promise of a fight to come. The small cabin in the woods became their war room. As Caleb's strength returned, a new kind of energy settled between them, a quiet, focused partnership that needed few words. The foundation of their fight was the preacher's ledger, its neat columns of figures a testament to a meticulous and patient evil. They spent hours by the firelight, studying the names, the dates, the stolen acres. It was the evidence, but it was not enough. A book could be dismissed as a forgery. The real proof was in the hearts and minds of the people who had been terrorized into silence. "They are too afraid to speak," Caleb said one evening, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt as he stared into the fire. "Your father has wrapped his greed in the word of God. To stand against him is to stand against their own salvation. Then we must offer them a different kind of salvation," Evelyn replied. She was cleaning the rifle he had been teaching her to use, her movements now practiced and sure. Her short hair and boyish clothes had become a part of her, a shedding of an old skin. "We must show them that their strength, together, is greater than his power to intimidate them alone." They began at night, moving like shadows through the familiar territory. Their first visit was to the Miller homestead. Tom Miller was back, his face a roadmap of bruises that had healed into purple and yellow monuments of his beating. His spirit, however, was still broken. He listened to them from the doorway of his new, hastily built shelter, his eyes darting nervously into the darkness.
"He will kill us all,"
Tom whispered, looking at his wife, Mary, who clutched their children close. It was Evelyn who spoke, her voice calm and clear. "He has been killing you slowly, Tom, with drought and despair and fear. He takes your land, your livelihood, your hope. Is that not a slower kind of death?" She stepped forward into the dim light from his lantern. "I am his daughter. I lived in his house. I saw his hypocrisy every day. I am not afraid to stand against him, but I cannot do it alone." Caleb unrolled the ledger on a wooden crate. He pointed to the entry for the Miller land, showing Tom the pitiful amount recorded and the far larger sum received from the mining company. "He did not just steal your land, Tom. He stole your children's future and called it God's will." They left them with that, a seed of rebellion planted in the parched soil of their fear. They moved on, from one small, struggling homestead to the next. Some slammed the door in their faces. Others listened with dead, hopeless eyes. But in a few, they saw a flicker of anger, a spark of defiance. Evelyn's testimony, coming from the preacher's own blood, was a powerful weapon. It gave them permission to doubt, and in their doubt, they found the first shoots of courage. The turning point came with the news of Jacob. The boy, it turned out, had not been in the house during the fire. He had been in the barn, trying to lead the horses out, and had been knocked unconscious by a falling beam. When he came to, he saw Silas Croft and another man watching the blaze, their faces lit with triumphant glee. Terrified, Jacob had fled into the woods, eventually finding his way to a neighboring ranch. When Sarah Beckett, who had been found wandering in a daze by the same rancher, was reunited with her son, his story spread like wildfire through the disenfranchised community. The fire had not been an act of God. It was a cold-blooded act of men. The whispers against the Reverend grew louder. The foundation of his power, built on fear and faith, was beginning to crumble. Caleb and Evelyn knew the time had come. They had to bring the fight out of the shadows and into the light. The following Sunday, they rode into town. They were not hiding. They were a statement. Caleb, tall and grim in the saddle, his wound a dull ache in his side. Evelyn, riding beside him, her face set with a calm resolve that was more intimidating than any weapon. The people of Blackridge stopped and stared. They saw the preacher's daughter, dressed as a ranch hand, riding with the outlaw he had condemned. They saw a rebellion in plain sight. They dismounted in front of the church and were met at the doors by Tom Miller, his face no longer afraid, but hard with purpose. Behind him stood a dozen other ranchers and their wives, the people who had chosen to stand. They were a small, grim-faced congregation of their own. They walked into the church together. Reverend Marsh was at the pulpit, his sermon in full, theatrical swing. He was speaking of the serpent in their midst, his eyes flashing with practiced zeal. He faltered when he saw them, his words catching in his throat. A collective gasp rippled through the pews. Caleb walked down the center aisle, his boots echoing in the sudden, profound silence. Evelyn was at his side, the ranchers following behind them like a solemn honor guard. "You speak of serpents, Reverend," Caleb said, his voice ringing out in the cavernous space. He stopped before the pulpit, holding up the leather-bound ledger. "But the only serpent in this town is the one who uses this holy book to hide the crimes he records in this one." He opened the ledger on the front pew for all to see. "Here are your names," he said, his voice directed to the congregation. "Here is the land your fathers and grandfathers worked and bled for, and here is the price your preacher paid for it, and the much larger price he sold it for. He has been bleeding you dry and calling it a holy sacrifice." "Lies!" the Reverend thundered, his face turning a deep, apoplectic red. "This is the devil's work. This man is a wanted criminal. He has bewitched my daughter, turned her from the path of righteousness." "The only path you ever showed me, Father," Evelyn said, her voice clear and strong, "was the path of hypocrisy, the path of greed dressed in piety." She turned to the people, her people. "Look at him. Does he look like a man of God? Or does he look like a thief who has been caught with his hand in the collection plate?" The crowd was on its feet, a confused, angry murmur sweeping through them. They looked at the preacher, at his contorted, furious face, and at his daughter, her expression open and honest. They looked at the grim-faced ranchers standing with her. The doubt she had planted had bloomed into open disbelief. Cornered, exposed, his authority disintegrating before his very eyes. The Reverend Josiah Marsh was stripped of everything but his rage, his veneer of piety burned away, revealing the raw, violent core of the man beneath, his eyes burning with a hatred that was anything but holy, fixed on Caleb. "You have brought damnation upon this house!" he screamed, his voice a raw shriek. In a movement so swift no one saw it coming, he reached inside his clerical coat and pulled out a small, silver derringer. It looked like a toy in his hand, but it was deadly. He aimed it not at the crowd, not at his daughter, but at the man who had brought his world crashing down. He fired. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space, but in the split second before the hammer fell, Evelyn had moved. It was not a thought, but an instinct, a pure, selfless impulse of love. She threw herself in front of Caleb, a desperate, protective shield. The bullet caught her high on the shoulder. The force of it spun her around, a small cry of pain escaping her lips. She collapsed, her eyes wide with shock, not pain, as she fell into Caleb's arms. For a moment, the world stood still. Caleb looked down at the blood blooming on her shirt, at her pale, slack face, a roar of pure, primal rage, a sound beyond grief or anger, rose in his throat. He gently lowered her to the floor. His eyes, when he lifted them, were the color of a winter storm. They were the eyes of a killer. He moved toward the pulpit, his hand dropping to his Colt, The preacher was fumbling to reload the single-shot pistol, his hands trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. The townsfolk scattered, screaming, trying to get out of the way. They all saw what was about to happen. They were about to witness a man's execution. Caleb was a blur of motion. He crossed the space in 3 long strides, his pistol drawn and cocked before the Reverend could even raise his own weapon. He backhanded the derringer from the preacher's grasp, sending it clattering across the floor. He pressed the cold muzzle of his Colt against the man's sweat-beaded forehead.
Please,
the Reverend whimpered, all the fire and brimstone gone, replaced by the pathetic, pleading whine of a coward.
mercy.
Caleb looked into the terrified eyes of the man who had helped kill his brother, who had terrorized a town, who had just tried to kill him and had shot the woman he loved. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to pull the trigger, to send this man to the hell he so often preached about. It was not justice he wanted in that moment. It was vengeance. But then, through the red haze of his rage, he heard a voice.
Caleb, no!
It was Evelyn, pushing herself up on one arm, her face pale but her eyes clear. She was alive. The sight of her, was a splash of cold water. He looked from her to the sniveling man before him. To kill him now would be to become him, a man who ruled by violence and fear. It would be a betrayal of Evelyn, of the justice he had promised the Millers, of the man he was trying to become. Vengeance was for the dead. Justice was for the living. With a shuddering breath, he slowly, deliberately, lowered the hammer on his Colt and holstered it. He grabbed the front of the Reverend's coat and hauled him from the pulpit, dragging him down the aisle like a sack of grain. He shoved him into the arms of Tom Miller and the other ranchers.
He is yours,
Caleb said, his voice raw.
See that he faces a judge.
Then he ran back to Evelyn's side. The fever of madness that had gripped Blackridge finally broke. With the preacher in custody and his ledger as undeniable proof, the whole rotten structure collapsed. Sheriff Blevins, seeing which way the wind was blowing, saddled his horse and was gone before sunset. Silas Croft had vanished with him. The town council, shamed into action, appointed an interim sheriff, a quiet, honest blacksmith who had been among the men standing with Caleb. The church, for the first time, felt like it belonged to the people again. It was a long road to healing, but it was a beginning. A few weeks later, under a vast, cloudless blue sky, Caleb and Evelyn stood on the small, wind-swept hill overlooking the town. They stood before the small, unmarked fieldstone that was her mother's grave. Sarah Beckett, her face still etched with sorrow but with a new strength in her eyes, stood as their witness, her son Jacob at her side. There was no preacher, no organ music, no crowd. Caleb took her uninjured hand. His was scarred and calloused. Hers was smaller, but with a new toughness to it. They did not exchange rings. They had already exchanged everything that mattered. Their vows were the unspoken promises they had fulfilled in fire and blood. In whispered confessions and shared silence, they were scarred. They were weary, but they were survivors. And in the quiet of that afternoon, under the watchful eye of the open sky, they became husband and wife. The final scene of their story was not an ending, but a continuation. They rode together, side by side, across the sun-drenched prairie. They were not riding away from Blackridge, but toward a future they would build themselves on a piece of land that had been returned to the Beckett family. The sun was warm on their faces, the air clean and sweet with the smell of sagebrush. Caleb looked at Evelyn, her short hair ruffled by the breeze, a small, genuine smile on her lips. The profound sadness that had once lived in her eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady light. They were still scarred, and always would be. But the wounds had become a part of their strength, a reminder of what they had endured and overcome, together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, they stopped their horses on a low rise to watch the day die. The first stars began to prick the deep velvet of the night sky. in the vast, profound silence of the prairie. Evelyn leaned toward him, her head resting on his shoulder. She whispered, her voice a soft echo of the promise he had once made to her in the darkness. "You waited for me." She tilted her head up to look at him, her eyes shining in the starlight. "But I will not ever make you wait again." Caleb said nothing. He simply pulled her close, a firm, gentle pressure, holding her as if she were the anchor of his world. Above them, the stars burned, vast and eternal, silent witnesses to the quiet, resilient, and hard-won love of two souls who had found their home not in a place, but in each other. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.